Last Days of Budapest is the first book to tell the story of the Hungarian capital in the Second World War. I'm going to show you the secret histories and the hidden stories that these buildings have to tell.
I lived in Budapest for more than 25 years. From the first day that I arrived, I sensed the weight of history and that this was a haunted city. I heard so many stories of loss and survival, and of life and death amid the destruction of war and the Holocaust. It was listening to my late father-in-law, Robert Ligeti, recounting how he repeatedly escaped from the Nazis and that Arrow Cross that made me realise that I had to tell the story of the city. From the early days of optimism at the start of the war, the failed attempts to change sides, the Nazi invasion, and the utter horror of the winter of 1944 and 1945.
This building, in a way, embodies the ambivalence of Hungary during the early years of the Second World War. The Andrássy Palace, with the full knowledge and support of the Andrássy family, one of Hungary's most renowned aristocratic dynasties, who produced prime ministers and all sorts of government ministers and MPs and politicians, was handed over the building, a large part of the building, to various Polish resistance organisations. During the early years of the war, especially, it was a centre of Polish resistance. Countess Klara Andrássy, who lived here, and it's easy to imagine her standing on that balcony, looking out over the Danube at the beauty of Budapest and all its glory.
Her married name was Princess Kaja Odescalchi, and she was a central figure in a barely known British-Hungarian rescue operation in which the British Embassy was deeply involved. Declassified documents in the British National Archives state very clearly that she was a key British agent in the Polish rescue operation. To bring these Polish soldiers into Hungary, because the two countries had a border at the time, and take them from Hungary to Yugoslavia so they could go to Western Europe and join the Free Polish Forces. And not just Polish soldiers, but also some Jewish refugees as well were brought into Hungary. All of this was happening with the full knowledge and support of the Hungarian government, even though, at the time, Hungary was allied with Nazi Germany.
And that carried on until March the 19th, 1944, when the Germans invaded. This was one of the first places they came to that very morning. They smashed their way through the doors and they shot everyone inside.
The SS and the Gestapo set up one of their main headquarters here.
Hannah Arendt, the great German Jewish philosopher who wrote about Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem in 1961, described the Nazi functionary and the key architect of the Hungarian Holocaust as embodying the banality of evil. Arendt was wrong. Eichmann wasn't banal. He was a sustained, determined mass murderer who pushed for the extermination of Hungarian Jewry at every possibility. But for me, the real banality of evil is this rather run-down, slightly decrepit apartment building on Schwabhedge in Budapest. Now Karthausy Street number 4A. During the war, it was the site of Eichmann's office and one of the key headquarters of the Gestapo. The basements were torture chambers. People who came here had very little chance of walking out alive.
But to look at it now, there's nothing to indicate what happened here. There's no plaque, there's no memorial, there's nothing at all to show that during 1944, this was the epicenter of evil.
"80 years ago, this corridor was a place of terror. To be brought down the stairs here was to enter a world of death, of murder and torture. The walls, the rooms resounded with the screams of the victims. The floors were awash with blood. Nowadays, this corridor in the basement of the building is a place of storage. It's impossible to imagine how that must have been, especially when we see the place now. It just looks so normal and so everyday, yet this was truly a place of terror.
But there were some who stood against evil, including a group of courageous neutral diplomats. This building in the castle district was once one of the most important diplomatic sites, but it's now semi-abandoned. There's nothing to tell its story, no plaque or memorial. Until April 1941, it housed the British legation and was a centre of the Polish rescue operation. Later in the war, it was taken over by Switzerland.
Karl Lutz was the Swiss Deputy Consul General. Switzerland was the protecting power for British and American interests during the Second World War, so he actually moved into the former site of the British legation in the Castle Hill, and he took over the former American legation on Freedom Square in downtown Budapest. Now, Lutz was a very brave, honourable and ethical man who wanted to save as many Jewish people as he could, and he started issuing protection papers saying that people were under Swiss protection or even had the same status as Swiss citizens. Papers became very valuable and highly sought after.
The glass house was under Swiss diplomatic protection. It was declared to be Swiss territory, essentially, by Karl Lutz, whose rescue work saved thousands of lives.
This courtyard, the centre of the Uweghaus, the glass house, was 80 years ago a place of salvation and desperation. Thousands of people were crammed in here, desperately trying to avoid the Arrow Cross Nazi death squads and the SS that were rounding Jews up and shooting them into the river. Many of the people who lived here survived. Some of the young people who met here even got married and had children after the war. If you look at it now, it seems a very run-down, ramshackle place. But at the time, 80 years ago, this was a place of hope and survival among desperate and murderous times.
His name was not as well known as Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat who ran a similar rescue operation, but it certainly should be, because he was a true hero of the Second World War. Lutz stayed here all through the siege, even though, as a neutral diplomat, he could have left.
His reward was very meagre. When he went back to Switzerland, his bosses were angry with him for playing with the diplomatic system to save Jewish people.
Wallenberg ran a complex rescue operation with bases all over the city, from a bank in the heart of downtown Pest to a discreet townhouse in Buda's historic castle district.
This is where Raoul Wallenberg and his comrades and his colleagues had a base, under the ground in the cellar at number 15 Uri Street. This was one of a number of places where they were operating in secret during the war, and this cellar was where they kept what they called the treasury, which was the records of all the money that was spent and received. It goes quite deep underground and actually connects to a centuries-old labyrinth of tunnels that date back to the Ottoman era under Castle Hill. You can imagine dozens of people down here taking shelter from the bombardment, taking shelter from the Arrow Cross raiding parties, and the incredible difficult conditions that they must have been in. There was virtually no toilet facilities here, for example. There's no running water. There's nowhere to wash. But people kept carrying on. They carried on with the resistance operation, and they carried on with the rescue operation in the most difficult, arduous conditions.
Some people managed to save themselves, including my late father-in-law and his little sister Zsuzsa. Robbie was 14, a brave boy who broke the rules, and that saved his life. He had already escaped an Arrow Cross roundup.
Behind me is an empty lot. During the war, it was the site of the Jewish orphanage. There's nothing here now to say what once stood here. In December 1944, Robbie's parents placed him and his little sister Zsuzsa here, believing they would be safer. That for a while they were. The building was under Swedish protection and there was food supplies. Then, on December the 24th, the Arrow Cross arrived. They rounded up the children and they took them away. Many of them did not survive and were shot into the Danube. But luckily, Robbie had already found a hiding place. He hid there overnight with Zsuzsa, and the next morning they made it back to their parents. All four of them survived the war. That was one of many stories that he told me.
Robbie and Zsuzsa's escape from the Arrow Cross is just one of many stories of survival in my book. By late December 1944, only half of Budapest Jews were still alive, crammed into 2 ghettos. The Great Synagogue stood on the edge of the main ghetto, where Robbie and his family had been moved. Many of Budapest Jews could not believe what was happening to them. A once prosperous community, thoroughly assimilated and interwoven into Hungarian life, was now dying in the last few months of the war.
The Hungarian Jewish citizens who believed themselves to be loyal and proud Hungarian citizens were forced into a ghetto.
Thousands were shot into the Danube by the Arrow Cross or died on the death march to the Austrian border. Thousands more died of hunger, cold and illness in the ghetto and were buried in a mass grave in the synagogue courtyard. The Last Days of Budapest also tells the story of the siege of the city through the lives of everyday people, such as a Christian doctor hiding her Jewish neighbours and a teenage Hungarian soldier fighting the Russians as they advanced street by street, block by block, and room by room, as the population froze and starved. Nowadays, 80 years on from the end of the war, and many more decades of hardship under communism, Budapest is once again dazzling its visitors with its beauty.